Welcome to our fifth lesson. Today, we'll be fully entering Sufi territory because our topic is the human journey towards perfection. So what we'll try is to outline that journey with a special focus on knowledge, and not just any kind of knowledge, but self-knowledge. That's the knowledge that Sufis strive for. And in that journey, we'll pay special attention to Sufi psychology. What does that mean? It's the science of understanding the ego, of understanding the human soul. So we'll be paying close attention to this aspect. So I would like to start with a famous Hadith Qudsi. A Hadith Qudsi is a saying from God, but uttered by the Prophet Muhammad. So it's God channeling certain statements to Muhammad and he then relating those statements. And this famous statement goes like this: I was a hidden treasure and I loved to be known. That's why I created the world. I was a hidden treasure and I loved to be known. That is why I created the world. So this sentence, which Sufis love very much, tells us the very reason for creation, the very reason behind existence. And we see here that we have love and knowledge. I loved to be known. I loved to be known. So love and knowledge always go together in the Sufi tradition, and they both play a very important role in the human journey. In Sufism, maybe a little bit similar to Hinduism, we find certain schools, and some schools, they focus more on knowledge, and other schools, they emphasize love. Similarly to the Bhakti and the Jnana tradition in Hindu spirituality. The most important representative of the school of knowledge, without any doubt, is the great Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi. Ibn al-Arabi is sometimes called the great master, the Sheikh al-Akbar, because he is unsurpassed in his theoretical, metaphysical exposition of the Sufi path. He went very, very deep in more than 400 works that are attributed to him. And he addresses almost any theoretical point that you could imagine in connection with Islamic thought and practice. Ibn al-Arabi, he was born in Murcia, which is today located in Spain. So he is an Andalusian sage. And especially in the last decades, he has attracted a lot of attention by Western scholars. So there are a lot of great books written about his works, and also most of his works have been translated into English. Among them, the Futuhat al-Makkiyya, the Meccan Revelations, and the Fusus al-Hikam, another very important work, the Bezels of Wisdom. The most important representative of the school of love, and I think that's not surprising to anyone, is Jalaluddin Rumi. Rumi wrote about 70,000 verses of poetry. So whereas Ibn Arabi wrote prose, Rumi focused entirely on poetry, which a great part of which is in praise of the beloved. So there is a lot of love poetry, love-intoxicated poetry, which doesn't mean that Rumi doesn't also value knowledge. The Masnavi, in fact, his main work of spiritual teaching, is full of verses teaching the inner knowledge of the Sufi path. So we should not think that these two approaches of Ibn Arabi and Rumi, sometimes they are called the greatest Sufis of all times, that these two schools are somehow in opposition to each other, because they just represent two modes of human perfection that manifest in different perspectives. So you remember maybe the story of the blind man and the elephant touching different parts of the elephant, but then just really fundamentally touching the same thing. So that's very much alike here with Ibn Arabi and Rumi, that basically they are talking about the same truth, but from different angles, from different approaches. So knowledge in the Sufi tradition is essential knowledge. We'll be speaking about knowledge today, especially. We'll come to love in the next lesson. Next lesson will be focused on love. So Sufis maintain that if we can know God, God will know himself through us in our hearts. Going back to this statement, I created the world so that I can be known. So by striving for self-knowledge, we actually help God fulfill his or her purpose of creation. And this knowledge happens through gradual unveiling, or what is called kashf in Arabic, unveiling what is already in us. Another hadith, whosoever knows his self knows his Lord. This is a very famous prophetic saying. Whosoever knows his self knows his Lord. So self-knowledge leads to knowledge of the divine. And Sufis take this hadith very serious. They put it into practice, and all their quest, all their searching is about knowing God, getting to know God. And let me also quote the great early Sufi Bayazid Bistami, who says, "The thing we tell of can never be found by seeking, yet only seekers find it. The thing we tell of can never be found by seeking, yet only seekers find it." So all the Sufi seeking, which is in fact an unveiling insight to gain that knowledge, all those practices are directed to this very aim. Now, let us look a little bit at what happened that we found ourselves in this earthly realm, in this forgetfulness of this essential knowledge. Muslims explain this with the story of Alast. Why is it called Alast? Because it goes back to a question mentioned in the Quran. Alastu bi rabbikum? Am I not your Lord? And this question was asked by Allah to all the souls. So you imagine, this is like before the beginning of time, in a primordial realm, Allah asks all the souls, am I not your Lord? Alastu bi rabbikum? And they replied, yeah, Bali, we testify. Yeah, we testify. Yes, we testify. So this is the eternal covenant of Alast, the eternal pact made before the beginning of time between God and all the creatures. But because we have forgotten our promise of knowing the Lord, of testifying that he or she is our Lord, because of that forgetfulness, we have fallen from our original state. Now, this falling from the original state is not to be confused with original sin, which we have in Christianity. Islam doesn't know any original sin. But the fact that we find ourselves in this earthly plane, forgetful of who we are, this fact brings us into a state of separation from our essence. And Rumi very beautifully speaks about this separation at the beginning of the Masnavi, his greatest work of teaching. And the first 18 verses, the first 18 baits of the Masnavi, which is arguably the most famous part of the Masnavi, speak about this very sleep of forgetfulness, this very distance from our essence. It's called the Song of the Reed Flute. And these 18 verses, they say, contain the whole of the Masnavi. So Masnavi, you imagine it's like 6 thick volumes of poetry, 10,000s of verses, and all of that is said to be contained in these verses. And they are also the verses that Rumi is said to have written by his own hand, the only verses that he wrote by his own hand. And I will only recite the first 4 verses, first in Farsi and then in English. بشنو از نی چون حکایت می کند از جدایی ها شکایت می کند کس نیستان تا مرا ببریده اند در نفیرم مرد و زن نالیده اند سینه خواهم شرح از فراق تا بگویم شرح درد اشتیاق هر کسی که دور ماند از اصل خویش باز جوید روزگار وصل خویش. Listen to the reed and the tale it tells, how it sings of separation. Ever since they cut me from the reed bed, my wail has caused men and women to weep. I want a heart that is torn open with longing, so that I might share the pain of this love. Whoever has been parted from his source longs to return to that state of union. Whoever has been parted from his source longs to return to that state of union. So, using the metaphor of the reed flute, the ney, which is a very important sacred instrument in Turkey and also in Iran, Rumi uses this image of the ney of the reed flute that is cut off from the reed bed and yearns to return to that place, to its home. It is that pain of separation that drives us on the spiritual path, that longing that incites us to seek, to dig deeper. And it's very precious, this pain. It's not a kind of masochistic pain or, complain, oh, why did this happen to me? No, it's actually the knowledge that the pain itself is the remedy. So it's a very famous phrase also in Persian and Turkish poetry, derdim bana derman imiş. So my pain is my remedy. The symbol of the ney is also powerful because the process of making a ney, making a reed flute, very beautifully explains what the human being has to go through. So first of all, the master will take this reed from the reed bed, cut it off, take it to his workshop. And then what do you have to do? First of all, to make a flute, you have to hollow out the reed, which means we have to become empty. We have to become empty of all those tendencies in us that separate us from God, separate us from our essence, namely the ego and all its tendencies. We'll speak about that in detail. And after that, the master takes a blazing hot iron and makes holes into the body of the reed, into the reed flute, so that later the master can put the fingers on the flute and play on it. So the metaphor here is the hot iron being all those travails and difficulties, all those things God puts in our path to mature us, to take us to maturity. And only then the divine can play on the flute, and the nafs al-Rahman, the divine breath, can stream through us, and we can play beautiful melodies. So let's just listen a little bit to the melancholic sound of the ney, weeping and longing to return to its essence. So the ney is longing to return, longing to end this separation, just like we are also separated from our source. And you could also say that what they call hell in religion is actually separation from God. Because all our hellish, let's use that word, all our hellish experiences on earth, so hell is not so much a place out there in this perspective, but it's really what we experience here and right now. All these hellish things come from our state of separation. Of course, sometimes Sufis also say there is no hell, there is no evil, there is only goodness and beauty. But that needs to be seen from the state of consciousness they are speaking from. At a certain level, Sufis are able to see the beauty and the grace of God in everything, even in the worst calamities, the worst catastrophes. We can talk about war or climate change in a modern language. As we said, that in the divine wrath or jalal, there is always an aspect of divine mercy or jamal. So we shouldn't conclude from this that Sufis deny evil, because otherwise there would be no need for all those teachings on how to overcome the imperfections and the evil qualities within us. There would be no need for the hot iron to burn those holes into the flute. So, what is that true knowledge which takes us back to our origin? True knowledge is the knowledge of truth. Al-Haq. And Al-Haq, the truth, is also one of the names of God. Maybe even the most important, or one of the most important names of God in Sufism. Because Sufis are the ones who adhere to truth under all circumstances. Haq can mean both truth and also reality. And from al-haq, another word is derived, which is the word tahaqquq, or spiritual realization, attaining to truth, realizing truth. Now, the knowledge of truth is not some kind of theoretical understanding of concepts. So there is a fundamental difference here between the Sufi way of knowing and our postmodern mindset. In the postmodern mindset, truth is denied. Everything is relative. And even metaphysics, even spirituality is not considered a reality. And this is the reason why we find so much chaos on earth right now. We are living in an age where there is no truth, where there is no knowledge of truth. So from a Sufi perspective, that mindset is at the very center of all our modern diseases, of all our modern problems. So that knowledge of truth from the Sufi perspective is a kind of knowledge that is deeply rooted in faith, in iman. And what is faith? Faith is certainty of the heart. So let me tell you a story from the Masnavi. There is a little boat on the sea, and in the boat is a boatsman who's rowing, keeping the boat afloat, and his passenger is a grammarian, a teacher of language, linguistics. And this grammarian gets bored and he starts asking the boatsman, "Do you know anything about grammar? Do you know the secrets of syntax?" And the boatsman responds, "No, I've never heard of syntax. I don't know anything about grammar." "Oh, then you have wasted half of your life." And the boatsman falls silent. He gets sad. Have I wasted my life? And as they are continuing, moving on in the sea, suddenly a heavy storm comes up and the waves start to get stronger and stronger and stronger. And in the midst of all this turmoil, the boatsman asks the grammarian, "Oh, professor, do you know how to swim?" The professor, who's already scared, says, "No, I don't know." "Oh," says the boatsman, "then you have wasted your whole life." So, swimology, the knowledge of swimming, is what the Sufis are after. It is the real knowledge of how to swim in the sea of the divine. And that knowledge is already present in the heart, in each one of us. We don't have to look for it anywhere else. But we need to ask for it. We need to be a talib of this knowledge, wanting that knowledge. Again, beautifully expressed in the prayer of Prophet Muhammad when he says, "O Lord, show us the things as they really are. Grant us that essential knowledge." Nowadays, people tend to confuse knowledge, and again, going back to that story of the ignorant grammarian, most people nowadays in the world, they think that knowledge of the mind, knowledge of facts and informations is the real knowledge. So what we see today is a focus on the acquisition of knowledge with no real relevance to our fundamental task in life. Facts and mental information can never teach us anything about what it means to become fully human. And that is the great dilemma of academia. That's the great dilemma of being intellectual. So, in our modern understanding, the mind refers to the rational powers, the rational faculties, to the discursive and analytical functions. Whereas the heart, when we speak of the heart, nowadays we usually mean emotions and feelings and those kind of irrational qualities. Now, this is, from the Sufi perspective, this is a very shallow understanding. It is really just the most external aspects of what the mind and the heart are about. Because the heart in Sufism is the center of knowledge, is the power of intuitive intelligence and spiritual awareness. A kind of awareness that transcends all rational processes. A knowledge, an intuition, a knowing that unifies the knowing subject with the known object. So the one who knows, who's trying to know, becomes one with what is known. So there is no more duality in that kind of knowledge of the heart. And the mind then becomes illuminated by the heart with that kind of knowing. So the mind is no more something that takes us into separation, into fragmentation, running around here and there, confused, thoughts that we cannot control, yeah, our ordinary state of mind. No, the mind then becomes a servant, becomes a Muslim, comes to be in service of that essential knowledge. And we reach a kind of understanding that truly brings about unity. As it says in another hadith, so you see we are quoting quite a few hadith today because they really establish what is essential on the Sufi path. And in this hadith it says, "My heavens and my earth do not embrace me, but the heart of my believing servant does embrace me." Again, this is hadith Qudsi, so God speaking through the mouth of the Prophet Muhammad. "My heavens and my earth do not embrace me, but the heart of my believing servant does embrace me." Sufis also speak about 3 levels of knowledge, or 3 levels of certainty. Yaqeen in Arabic. Ilm al-yaqeen, which is the knowledge of certainty. Ain al-yaqeen, which is the eye of certainty. And haqq al-yaqeen, which is the truth of certainty. Now, knowledge of certainty is knowledge about something, knowing about something. Ain al-yaqeen is the level of experience, of seeing the truth. So seeing with your own eyes, experiencing with your own eyes, is a higher level of knowing, because here you have a direct experience. But haqqa yaqeen is total unity with the object of knowledge, becoming one with that knowledge. So we already said that all practices of Sufism have only one goal, and that is allowing people to open up their eyes and see things how they are. Learning to see God in everything, one has to learn how to be aware of God constantly. And what is it that clouds this awareness? What is it that comes in between? It is what the Sufis call the nafs, the ego. Rumi says, the mother of all idols is your own ego. And sometimes in Sufi poetry, the nafs is compared to a stubborn donkey. Rumi also compares the different vices and qualities of the nafs to a pack of dogs, especially those qualities like anger or fierceness or high temperament. And those qualities that pertain um, to pleasures, to lust, are sometimes shown in the metaphor of a pig. So, not to insult the dogs and the pig, Rumi was a lover of animals, but sometimes those images help us understand better. So, the path of the Sufi is a process of inner transformation. And that inner transformation is first and foremost the transformation of the nafs, of the human ego. Because as the Quran says in the 13th surah, God is closer to you than your jugular vein. Your jugular vein, that vein here, that life-giving vein. So God is so close to us that only we ourselves can be the obstacle. Only we ourselves can come in between. So speaking about Sufi psychology, that's what we'll be getting into now. We first have to make clear that Sufi psychology is very different from modern psychology. Because modern psychology, what is the goal of modern psychology? It is freedom of the self. Whereas Sufi psychology leads to freedom from the self. So that's a very important difference. The modern soul, the modern human soul, is so full of knots that result in negative feelings like anxiety, aggression, depression, and so on. And in order to escape from all those uncomfortable elements, we resort to constant distraction. And a soul that is already chaotic becomes attracted to an ever more chaotic world. And that's why so many modern human beings are caught in this spiral, because they have lost this knowledge of sacred psychology that Sufism and also other traditions teach us. Now, what is this nafs? Nafs in Arabic simply means self, and sometimes also soul. Now, what is this self? First of all, we speak about self so much. We have self-help books. But what is it that we are trying to help? What is this self that we are trying to help? William Chittick talks about this in his book, in his introduction to Sufism. And he says, well, all these authors of self-help books, they have actually no clue what is this self that they are trying to help. In Islam, the self, the nafs, is considered indefinable. The self, in a way, is the I of the moment. And because each moment is new and there is a constant flux, a constant transformation, the self has no constancy, is not something that we can fix. And the Sufi is the one who lives in the awareness that his self is whatever he is at the present moment, is whatever his level of awareness is at in the present moment. That's the self. Because the Sufi strives to be the child of the moment, or a Sufi ibnul waqt. The Sufi is the child of the moment. Again, we have another famous Quranic saying here, which is, whoever knows himself knows his Lord. So to the extent that we know ourselves, we can also know God. I'm also reminded of the teachings of Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, and the great Ramana Maharshi said, the mind will subside only by means of the inquiry, who am I? The thought, who am I, destroying all other thoughts, will itself finally be destroyed like the stick used for stirring the funeral pyre. So that inquiry, who am I, what is that self, is very close also to what the Sufis are striving for, what the Sufis are looking for. So we can really speak of a kind of Sufi Advaita here, Sufi mindfulness, a Sufi quest of understanding the self. Rumi uses the image of death for the self because he says, at each moment of our existence, a new self arrives to us from God, just as in this body, a new breath arrives. Now, because the self is so unstable, the nafs is so unstable, it attaches itself to all those things. It is imperfect to the degree that our state is raw, as Rumi says, as we are not cooked. And that aspect of the nafs that is raw, that causes separation, is also sometimes called the carnal soul. This brings up a little bit of association with some kind of Christian frugal piety, the carnal soul. But it is really that quality in us, that animalic quality that tries to always keep us down and keep us away from God. Now, I want to talk about the 7 levels of the nafs according to Sufi psychology. And these 7 levels, they present us with a very sophisticated psychology that Sufi teachers in all the ages have applied to their students as a way of tracking their spiritual progress. Now, when I will present these 7 levels to you, it looks like a linear process, like you pass from one stage to the next stage and then to the third stage and fourth and so on. And in a way, yes, you pass and you leave behind a stage and you pass to the next stage. But maybe rather than looking at it in a linear way, we can also understand it as different potentialities or different possibilities, different states that exist in us at the same time. And maybe at some point, we are in a higher state. At another point, we fall into a lower state. So we can also look at it in a way of more like a spiral. So this, what I will tell you now, these 7 stages, is based on teachings of an Anatolian saint called Hazrat Ibrahim Haqqi Erzurumi, and was adapted by the Jarahi Sheikh Tosun Bayrak al-Jarahi, of Turkish origin, but taught in the United States. And he says the first level is the nafs amara. And let me show this to you in a chart so this becomes more clear. So the first stage of the nafs in Sufi psychology is the nafs amara, the commanding self, or the self that incites to evil. At that level, at the level of the commanding self, the human soul is overpowered by animal qualities. What are those qualities? They manifest as ignorance, arrogance, lust, jealousy, envy, ambition, anger, negativity, and spending time on empty endeavors. So at that stage, the human being has no sense of morality and compassion and no conscience. Fully busy trying to get everything, whatever it wants. It's that Gollum quality. For those of you who have read or watched The Lord of the Rings, Gollum, that creature that always says, mine, 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 I want more. And people who are at that level, they are at constant denial. They refuse to believe that they have a problem. Like an addict, really like an addict who refuses to acknowledge that he needs therapy. The second stage is the stage of the nafsi lawama, the regretful or reproaching self, the self that blames itself for its shortcomings. So at this level, we move into a certain humbleness, repenting from time to time, becoming aware to some degree of our shortcomings. And at the nafsi lawama, we try to follow higher impulses. Sometimes instead of being close-hearted, we try to show love. Or despite our immorality, our usual state of immorality, we try to be moral. So we make a certain effort and we begin to understand what is the right thing to do. We also might to start worshiping God. We might to give alms. We start doing our prayers, but often in a hypocritical way because we want others to see what a good human being we are. At the same time, we realize that we are a hypocrite and we suffer from that hypocrisy. So what is the remedy at this stage? The remedy is giving of one's wealth, zakat, eating less, so the fasting like in Ramadan, and surrendering, taslim, Islam, surrendering to God in prostration, in prayer. Again and again, surrendering all those evil qualities to God. And in that process, the person can begin to see his faults more clearly, and the desire for change will grow. And at this stage, it is important that the human being submits to a teacher, to a guide that can take you onwards on the path. Once that stage is integrated, the next stage is the nafsi mulhima, the inspired self. At this stage, the seeker begins to take pleasure in spiritual practice, in prayer and meditation and other forms of spiritual exercises, and begins to taste the joy of those spiritual activities. Also, the human becomes motivated by ideals like compassion, service, and moral values. This is the true beginning of Sufi practice. At the same time, God sends inspirations. That's why it's called the inspired self. Inspirations to the human being, like dreams, sometimes revelations, maybe even miracles. Here, the teacher is very crucial because the teacher helps him see what is truly divine and what of those imaginations and dreams are temptations coming from the ego. So it's important to discern here between divine and ego. And it's very important in this stage that the aspirant follows the teacher's instructions to the word and strives to live in terms of higher values, divine values. And also, if you don't have a teacher, at least what can save your life at this stage is to hold on to the Sharia, the outer laws of religion, especially the 5 daily prayers. Because the ego will create all kinds of resistance towards those practices, all kinds of excuses to escape from the Sharia. For example, the ego will say, oh, now I have seen everything. I have realized everything. I've had my spiritual experiences. I don't need all those efforts. I don't need all those disciplines. I'm receiving God's messages directly, so I don't even need a guide. And I don't need all those exterior practices of ordinary people like fasting or praying and doing good deeds. So this is actually the voice of the ego in a spiritual disguise, trying to tell you, okay, you are already higher, you're something higher. It's the devil pretending to be God in a way, saying, you are the truth, you are now with Allah, and all those other things, they are for the ordinary people. So this is very dangerous. Now we move to the 4th stage, the nafs mutma'inna. And the nafs mutma'inna is the self at peace. Here, the soul has battled with the ego for a considerate amount of time. The ego is already weakened, and the seeker is more at peace. The great struggles of the earlier stages, they are over. The old attachments and desires, they are no longer binding. And gradually, the egoic self begins to let go. You start to accept difficulties with the same sense of security with which one also accepts benefits and blessings. And you are more ready to accept the orders of God. And at the same time, you're beginning to speak of the Prophet, of the Holy Quran. The tongue says beautiful words, and people will start to listen to you because what you share is the beauty and the truth coming from Allah by voicing those things you have discovered in your heart. Now the self can begin to disintegrate and let go of all its previous concerns with boundaries, and it can be reborn in an even more universal level. The nafs mutmainna is mentioned also in the Quran, in this verse, in the Surah Al-Fajr, the 27th surah. O the satisfied self at peace, return to thy Lord, while well pleased. Again, O the satisfied self at peace, return to thy Lord, well pleased and well pleasing, and enter amongst my good servants, and enter my paradise. And then the human passes through the nafs radiyah, the self which is pleased with his Lord. Here the human soul is completely at peace with God. The human is protected from doing wrong, and the heart is cleansed. It is filled with love and with peace. The heart has reached the truth of Islam and has surrendered the will to the greater will of Allah, the individual will to the greater will of Allah. So there is already a total control of the ego. And when the human at this stage prays and asks something from his Lord, Allah will immediately respond and answer their prayers. But there are 2 even higher stages, the 6th stage being the nafs mardiyah, and the nafs al-mardiyah is the self with which his Lord is pleased. So before we had the self which is pleased with his Lord, and here the self with which his Lord is pleased. Here, the human soul has come so close to its origins that all of God's attributes are reflected in him, begin to be reflected in him. The human realizes that all power to act comes from God, that it can do nothing by himself. This is also the realization of servanthood, of ubudiyat, of being an abd, being a servant. Abd is the Arabic term. And this knowledge, this consciousness of servanthood is very important in Islam. Ibn Arabi says that at this stage of the nafs mardiya, there is an inner marriage taking place between the self and the soul that heals the multiplicity. Everything becomes one single unified whole. You remember again the journey of La ilaha illallah from fragmentation towards the whole. So here we are beginning to become whole. And character traits at this stage include being forgiving, compassionate, and generous. And because of love towards all mankind, the human being at that stage strives to pull others out from the prison of their egos, like the ideal of the bodhisattva in Buddhism. And then we come to the seventh, to the highest state of realization, which is the nafs kamila. And the nafs kamila is the purified, the perfect self. Here, the battle with the ego, with the lower self, is won. All the tests have been passed, and one's ego has become a Muslim. The ego has become a Muslim, perfect in its surrender to God. All has become whole and perfect. There are no more needs and wishes except for what Allah wishes. This is the stage of pure good, pure knowledge, pure wisdom, and pure beauty. Totally conscious, every cell of the human body is now in a state of continuous dhikr, continuous remembrance and worship of the divine. And the only joy of the human being at this stage is the joy of seeing others turn towards God. And the pain of the human being is the pain of seeing others turn their backs towards God. At this stage, all the human love and sadness, even the anger, come never from himself, but they are all for Allah's sake. That kind of a human being, that kind of a perfected soul, is absolute justice. Everything he intends and does is equal to Allah's intentions. He has reached the final realization of La ilaha illallah. There is no God but God. One of the most painful things in the world for most of us who have not attained to that stage is the awareness of our own shortcomings, our own imperfection, our own stupidities. And I'm speaking from my own experience. So the Sufis are very scrupulous at uncovering those imperfections. And the great dilemma of our modern time is that we think we already know. We just need maybe a little bit of help. We don't need help, or maybe just a little bit of help by some experts. And we have all those branches of knowledge, science, technology, politics, academic learning, and so on. But all those attempts to rationalize things or to know won't get us very far, because we are actually escaping more and more from the real, from the essential knowledge. And all those definitions, false definitions of the self, trying to define the self in terms of psychological terms or attaching yourself to historical, nationalist, social, ideological, theological ideas, even Islamist ideas, all those concepts, false concepts, like false idols that we human beings are so good at creating, have led to so much chaos and so much tyranny and violence in the world, especially in the 20th century and still nowadays in the 21st century. So that's why God, Allah, according to the Sufi perspective, has sent the prophet and has sent the revelation to awaken people, to lead them out of this constant stream of ignorance that is sometimes so hard to get out of. Jihad, like the word Sharia also, is one of those very scary words that you always hear in the Western media, and you think that Islam is all about jihad, about killing the unbelievers. But what actually jihad means in the essential meaning is the inner jihad, killing the unbelievers in yourself. And those are, of course, the imperfections of the ego. We have a story here from the life of the prophet. I'm not sure if I already mentioned it, but if so, I will repeat it. That when one of those terrible battles of early Islam was finished and the warriors were returning home, and the prophet said to them, now we have finished the small jihad, which is the jihad, the physical jihad. Now let us turn to the real jihad, the big jihad, the jihad al-akbar, the greater jihad, which is the jihad, the war against your own ego. By the way, the Bhagavad Gita makes the same point and uses this war metaphor for the struggle to overcome your egoic tendencies. And even the war itself, the lesser war, the small jihad, has to be fought in a selfless and detached way. So we've already looked at the vices of the self when we were speaking about the 7 levels of the nafs, but I want to mention a few more qualities like greed, anger, spite, trying to gain attention of others, feeling self-important, the love for praise and approval, and the desire to be in control of other people and of situations. All those things, they are qualities of our ego. And Al-Kushairi says, one of the latent vices and secret maladies of the lower self is its love of praise. Whoever imbibes a draught of it will try and move the 7 heavens and 7 sublunar realms for the flutter of an eyelash. So in other words, whoever manages to conquer the love for praise, the love of praise, being praised by other people, will be able to move through the 7 heavens. So let me tell you a story that illustrates this point. As human beings, we always seek the approval of others, right? How much we are trying and we are changing ourselves and we are paying efforts to be approved. And one day, Mullah Nasruddin, that famous character of Islamic lore, the divine fool of Sufism, in a way, who's always portrayed sitting on a donkey the other way around, and his stories always lead the mind into places where, into absurd places where there is no more logic. So one day, Mullah Nasruddin is walking through the market of his hometown together with his grandson and his donkey. And the people, seeing Mullah Nasruddin with the donkey and his grandson, say, they have a healthy beast, so why are they so stupid to insist on walking? The mullah, annoyed by people's comments, got on the donkey. They went on a little more, and now the people, looking at the mullah on the donkey and the grandson walking next to the mullah said, "No wonder our youth is disrespectful. The man on the donkey is old enough to be wise in years, but he lets this poor boy, tender in years, suffer under the sun." Hearing this, the mullah quickly got down from the donkey and set his grandson on the donkey. Now they continued to walk a little more, and the people, seeing this, exclaimed, "Look at this! A perfectly healthy young man is enthroned on the donkey while letting his grandfather suffer in the heat. This is how you spoil a young one. This is how you spoil a young one who then grows up to be a demanding human being." Hearing this, the mullah and the grandson got annoyed, and they said, "Okay, now let's both get on the donkey." They went on, now the donkey carrying both of them, and the people observing this in the market now said, "How merciless they are. The poor donkey suffers under the burden of two people. The heavens will punish them for the way they abuse Allah's poor creature." So now, to silence the critics, the grandfather and the grandson went down from the donkey and lifted up the donkey on their shoulders and started walking. Of course, people were even more surprised, and more criticism followed. Let me show you an illustration by the famous tent makers of Egypt, illustrating this humorous story. I love it. If I had one of those, I think I would just hang it in my living room. So yeah, this is the story of the mullah, his grandson, and the donkey. And what do we learn from this story is really that you are the prisoner of those whose approval you seek. And that's one of the qualities of the nafs, that it always wants to be approved by others. At the end of this lesson, I would like to speak about fana and baqa. Fana is kind of the Sufi nirvana, the equivalent to the Buddhist nirvana, more or less. And it is that stage of negation, of completely dissolving the ego in God. The negation of the egocentric, separative reality. Baqa, on the other hand, is when you've reached that state of dissolving your ego, you move into baqa. Baqa is the affirmation. So you're moving back into the world to serve humanity in total awareness of the divine. And we'll be learning more about this when we speak about Sufi practice in the 7th lesson. But what is important to understand here is that these two concepts, fana and baqa, actually are already contained in the shahada. If you remember from the 2nd lesson, the shahada, there is no God but God, is a journey from negation to affirmation. So in a way, the shahada is the starting point of the journey, because with the shahada you become Muslim and you enter the path and you affirm God's oneness. And it is also the end of the journey, because the full realization, passing from negation into affirmation and then serving humanity, is what is actually meant by the shahada. And I'm indebted to William Chiswick here, who beautifully explains that, in fact, only baqa, or subsistence, is real. not fana, annihilation, because subsistence is the affirmation of an ancient reality, while annihilation is the negation of something that never truly was. Again, baqa is the affirmation of the ancient reality of God, whereas fana is the negation of something that never truly was. So at that stage of realization, when the human being is fully established in God consciousness and serves in the world, God says in Hadith Qudsi, when I love him, I become his hearing with which he hears, his sight with which he sees, his hand with which he grasps, and his foot with which he walks. And if he asks me for something, I give it to him. If he seeks refuge with me, I place him under my protection. And let's end with our Rumi poem and close today's session. گرد جهان جستم اغیار من، گشت یقینم که کس اغیار نیست. مشتریان جمله یکی مشتری است، جز که یکی رسته بازار نیست. ماهیت گلشن آن کس که دید، کشف شد او را که یکی خار نیست. خنب ز یخ بود و در او کردم آب، شد همه آب و زخم آثار نیست. جمله جهان لا یتجزا به دست، چنگ جهان را جز یک تار نیست. All the tasks of the world are different, but all are one. Know that he who complains that there is no beloved is drowned in the heart while seeking it. I sought round the world for others and reached certainty. There are no others. The buyers all are a single buyer. The bazaar has only one aisle. He who has seen the nature of the garden, to him has it been revealed that there are no thorns. When I filled the ice vat with water, it melted. No trace of it remained. The whole world is indivisible. The world's harp has but a single string.